Support for this program comes from Jazz on the Tube, the internet's largest collection of free streamable classic jazz videos. From Miles Davis to Louis Armstrong, from Thelonious Monk to Duke Ellington. You'll find it all on jazzonthetube.com. Start your free subscription today.
Hi, and welcome to Jazz Talk, a Jazz on the Tube podcast. My name is Ken McCarthy, and this is where we talk with people who are doing important work that supports and illuminates the music we love. The writers, the scholars, the educators, the filmmakers, the producers, and more.
Okay, welcome everybody. I was doing some research on my New Orleans book, which is either you have it now or it's going to come out soon. And I wanted to do some digging into Ornette Coleman's time in New Orleans. And I knew that he was staying with the Lasty family, musicians and spiritual people. Frank Lasty had his own church, but he was also a drummer, and he was the guy that was the first person apparently to bring a drum kit into a church. And that happened in New Orleans at the invitation of a woman named Mother Sales. And so I was looking for, okay, who is this Mother Sales? And there's not much about her. And I found this wonderful audio documentary about her, and I'm listening to it, loving it. And then I realized this guy's made like 20 documentaries, or I don't know how many, and each one is equally fascinating. They're on the whole spectrum of music, some on jazz, but on just the whole spectrum of music. Some of the most interesting audio documentaries I've ever heard on music. And luckily I was able to find him, because sometimes you can't find people on the internet. And luckily he answered me, and luckily he was willing to talk with us. So welcome, Matt Marble.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here. Happy Mardi Gras.
Oh yeah, that's right. Oh my God, it is literally Mardi Gras. How fitting.
I know, right?
So you're originally from Mississippi.
Correct.
And what town in Mississippi?
Jackson, the capital.
Oh, Jackson. Okay. And now you're living in Western North Carolina.
Greensboro, yeah.
Greensboro. And you guys can't see because this is also a video call as well as a audio call. But Matt's also a painter, in addition to being an audio documentarian. But you're also a musician, yeah?
Yeah, all the arts.
Okay. Amazing. So I don't even know where to start. First of all, tell everybody where your website is and where they can find these audio documentaries, please.
Yeah, the podcast series is called Secret Sound, and it explores the history of esotericism, or inner traditions of spiritual inner engagement in American music history, all the way back to ancient Native America up through essentially the present. But I'm working on a book now that covers a more narrow range, and that's at my website, mattmarble.net/secret-sound, I believe.
Great. So it's Matt with 2 T's, Marble,
Correct.
The way it's normally spelled, .net. It's such an important topic, because anybody that's, for instance, our audience is largely jazz, but they have big ears and they listen to lots of stuff.
Sure.
But for instance, just in the jazz world alone, if we just stick to that one area, a lot of those players had a rich spiritual life. I mean, let's take John Coltrane, for example.
Absolutely. Well, I have an episode on his wife, Alice. And yeah, within the series, there are 7 episodes that feature jazz artists. Like we look at Rahsaan Roland Kirk and the role of dreams in his music. We look at bandleader Vincent Lopez, who incorporated numerology, astrology, mind metaphysics into his stagecraft as a bandleader. He also did one of the earliest horoscope scores. We look at Ilan Phil Koran, who worked with Sun Ra, and astrology and African tradition were huge aspects of his musical practice. Mary Lou Williams, who ended up doing several kind of original masses, jazz masses. Her life story is very interesting. There's a nice range of artists, but jazz, like you were saying, has kind of a sacred history, and there's something inescapably spiritual about giving yourself to the intuitive process of improvisation, and that's kind of reaffirmed over the decades and centuries. But yeah, John Coltrane and Alice especially really stand out. They were explicitly spiritual in their aspirations.
I had a good friendship with Jerome Cooper, a percussionist, and he's known for playing with the Revolutionary Ensemble and with Leroy Jenkins and Cerrone, the bassist. He also played with Russ on Roland Kirk. He played with Cecil Taylor. So he was a real player, and he was an avid numerologist.
Oh wow!
Yeah, avid.
Yeah, that was big, and for a lot of people. I mean, you look at Art Ensemble of Chicago, and Roscoe Mitchell, I believe, was really into numerology as well. But they're all, numerology, astrology. These are all divinatory traditions. They're all symbolic systems, and so for musicians, for composers or improvisers, these symbolic systems can have really powerful and practical, creative agency.
Well, you're talking about you were talking about the horoscope symphonies or the horoscope. What?
Vincent Lopez did a horoscope music book that was a combination horoscope scores, which he commissioned another of his musicians to compose, and another numerology book as well. They were kind of put together in one book in 1940, I think. And then Mary Lou Williams did her Zodiac Suite in 1941, I think.
Well, there are
the earliest.
There are 12 houses in the Zodiac, and there's 12 tones.
Oh, yes.
and music turns out it's not calculus, but it definitely uses a lot of arithmetic.
Absolutely. I mean, well, there's the whole tradition of the music of the spheres through Pythagoras, and I mean, it goes pretty deep.
Are you ever going to do a show on Pythagoras?
I've kind of touched on him a lot. But yeah, that would be nice. I should do a deep dive on Pythagoras.
When you get to that, let me know. I have a friend who's connected with a guy who's owns the largest library of Greek medicine manuscripts.
Oh wow!
Yeah, and Greek is a misnomer. This is one of my pet things these days, so I'll share it with you and share it with our audience. The Aegean had two sides. It had the Greek side and what is now the Turkish side. And it turns out that if you name all the famous Greeks, like Pythagoras, like Hippocrates, like Galen, the medical guy, and it just goes on and on, they all lived on the Turkish side. So there was a huge amount of culture on that side of the Aegean, and those guys were connected to Persia and Egypt, right, and the East, much more so than the fellows on the other side.
Well, and the sources, are ultimately kind of Egyptian and in that region, for Pythagoras as well.
It's often presented as the Greek thinking sort of sprouted up from nowhere, but not really.
Oh yeah, it was appropriation.
yeah, well, synthesis.
The Western tradition of appropriation.
Yeah, and it's a good thing they did too. It benefited everybody. But it's a misnomer to think that the country of Greece solely was the origin of all this stuff. It was really a vast region. It just happened that Greek was the lingua franca for that whole region. So anybody that was doing anything was using the Greek language. Doesn't mean they were Greek. That's the same thing. I'm going to go off on another tangent, and then we'll get back to everybody always talks about the Arabic scientists of the 1000 AD. When Arabic science was very, very elevated, way more than European. But it's a misnomer to call those folks Arabs. They were people that wrote in Arabic. So some of them were Persians, and some of them were, which is not an Arab. Some of them were Central Asians, not Arabs. Some of them were Egyptians, not Arabs. Some of them, So when they say the golden age of Arabic medicine, it was the golden age when people used Arabic as the lingua franca, and that's the same thing with the Greek stuff. It wasn't that Greece was the end all and be all. It was that it was the lingua franca, and a lot of people who were educated were writing in Greek. But in any event, sorry to take you off on that tangent. I'm fascinated by Mary Lou Williams.
Oh yeah.
And we've done some shows on her because, for one thing, she plays her ass off. If anybody has not heard Mary Lou Williams play the piano, it is out there. And two, she was the teacher to Thelonious Monk and Bud Powell, who were the teachers to Sonny Rollins. And I don't think she gets credit for what she did. And she was, in addition to being a refined person, a tough broad, because she was playing in Kansas City in the 1930s as a woman.
Yeah.
So you weren't going to be a shrinking violet and pull that off. You had to have a lot of steel in you. So tell me about more, because that's all I know about her. That she could play, that she was a master educator, and that she had a lot of fortitude, more than the average person.
Yeah, for sure.
Because that was a tough environment. I mean, it was a fun environment for people, but it was also a rough environment. There was nothing genteel about.
Oh yeah, not very hospitable to women or of any kind of leadership status, which she was clearly capable of enacting. Yeah, she was a force. She was amazing. I kind of dove into her more after reading an incredible biography. I forget the name now. It's Morning Glory is in the title.
Oh.
It's a fantastic biography, but it really shows the spiritual kind of thread running through her work. She talks about, having these kind of psychic experiences and visions as a child, and, there might also be some mental illness involved, but extremely sensitive, which that would later on in her life get channeled into Catholicism, and kind of saint worship and intensive prayer. Like she would have a list of hundreds of names that she would be praying for. And it got almost like pathological religiosity, in the sense that she would take in so many people that her apartment would get overrun with these homeless people and kind of lost jazz musicians that she was trying to help. And so there was a period where she was really struggling to be this kind of maternal figure for so many people. But she kind of befriended some priests, some Catholic priests who helped guide her and kind of maybe toned down her religiosity to a more practical manner. And that's when she really kind of found a way to channel it into her music through the masses and whatnot. And I mean, I'm still discovering recordings of hers that I didn't know existed, because I don't know why it's been so kind of hushed and covered up. But yeah, I think there's a lot more to discover about her life and her body of work, because it was so rich. The first piece that really grabbed me was the Zodiac Suite. And that's where she composed a piece corresponding to each of the Zodiac, the 12 Zodiac signs. And it's beautiful music, and an interesting example of how astrology can be a muse to musicianship and composition in terms of creating moodscapes. That's something that was really unique that she was doing. Obviously Sun Ra around the same time was slowly kind of embracing that as a lifestyle and a stagecraft as well. But yeah, Mary Lou is a really special person.
And she wrote that in 1941, right? Is that?
I believe that's correct.
Yeah. So this is pre-bebop, I guess, slightly. The way I first encountered her, I went to a Catholic high school in Manhattan, and she was brought in to perform for the assembly.
Oh,
now
wow.
I'm 16 years old and I don't know anything about jazz, and I was like, yeah, whatever. And I regret, that I didn't know what I was being exposed to.
Yeah.
but so it's great that she found some spiritual guidance that helped her smooth out the practicalities
Yeah.
of living a human life and doing that. So she withdrew from music
Yeah.
for quite a while.
Yeah.
And
I think part of that was due to her kind of that kind of over religiosity, or this kind of she just went through a very intense period where she was kind of lost herself. And well, I shouldn't say that. I'm a little fuzzy on the biography, so I don't want to be too loose with what I say.
yeah, but I do know she withdrew from performance, and I think that was part of the thing that this priest, I think it was one guy in particular who helped her. And he helped her come back as a musician.
Yeah.
That there was a pretty significant gap, and then she came back and started performing again, and that was a time. Yeah.
I was just going to say she ended up not far from where I am. I think she was in Durham, North Carolina.
Oh, okay.
That's where she spent her last years.
That was a time when I think New York City was down to its last 2 or 3 jazz clubs. Like so not only was she experiencing whatever she was experiencing, but the whole infrastructure for jazz venues had just sort of collapsed in Manhattan,
right?
Which is where she lived at the time.
Well, one thing about her was she was fairly radical in that she, kind of like Miles Davis would later, but she would embrace as many styles as possible. She was always reinventing herself, always like actively seeking and exploring new ways of expressing herself. And so you see that come out in diverse styles. She incorporated rock into some stuff. She incorporated like more avant-garde composition on dissonances and stuff. And I mean, she was really all over the place. That's something that I really admire in a lot of artists, is when they find their full range and try out these different ways of manifesting their art. It's beautiful.
And then before that, she was the tutor. People would come to her apartment and learn harmony, and that included Monk, Powell, Bud Powell, Dizzy Gillespie, I think Miles, some other people came by, and she would show them things on the piano.
Yeah, her apartment was the spot.
Yeah, and why isn't that celebrated? Why don't we have that at the forefront of our consciousness when we think about bebop?
Yeah,
because it is. Someone's. Unfortunately, I'm gonna draw a blank on his name. But this great bass player, and I was expressing my concern about the future of jazz, and he said, "Don't worry, jazz will never disappear. There are always people that like to play chess. There will always be people that like to play jazz." And jazz is an intellectual, in addition to being an aesthetic and an artistic and emotional and spiritual pursuit. It is intellectual. You need a mind to get the most from it. Mm-hmm. In fact, I had this weird revelation. I wonder what you think about this. It dawned on me one day that all jazz musicians are nerds. we think of them as cool cats, and they're hip and they're cool, but at some level they're intense music nerds.
Well, the truth is they're both.
They're both. They're both. So tell me about Vincent Lopez and what was his story?
Yeah, he was one of the more striking figures to discover. I just kept finding these strange kind of linkages between his music and the kind of metaphysics that I was really interested in. But he came up alongside Whiteman as like one of the premier band leaders in America at kind of with the emergence of the radio boom. And he accidentally kind of found himself being a radio host and promoting his music through that, and got like $1 million deal to do these hotel gigs for that lasted decades. He had a TV show. He was very in the public eye for many decades, and that kind of waned around the period when jazz started kind of waning, like you were talking about. But he would do he grew up in a Catholic with a kind of intensely Catholic father who was fairly, it sounds like unstable, very stern, and also interested in kind of the paranormal and occult. So he was mixing rigorous devotional Catholicism with the occult, which is not very common, even though they have some similarities with the ceremony and whatnot. But so he rebelled against that, went to New York, became a piano kind of virtuoso from a young age. And the older he got, the more he embraced these metaphysical traditions. He was not interested in Catholicism. But so numerology and astrology were the two things that he was really drawn to. And so his stage shows would be kind of standard jazz swing music, but he would, at the end, or intermissions, he would offer numerological consultations to the audience members.
Oh, interesting.
He published a book on numerology and published books on astrology with musical examples. And another aspect that I found really interesting was that in the 30s, he was insistent that jazz be used as a form of music therapy, or swing music as music therapy. And he literally went to hospitals and had doctors implement swing music to patients. And that's at a time, kind of like you were saying, with Mother Seals, where the jazz wasn't welcome in the church because it was deemed satanic, or whatever. It was the same way in the hospitals. It was deemed as, music therapy was just emerging at that time with any kind of formalization, and a lot of racism was involved in keeping jazz out. But the main kind of reasoning that people excluded it was because it was too frenetic. So they thought it was like a nervous stimulation and it wasn't healthy. Whereas, like most people know, jazz makes you feel good, and feeling good is a very healthy thing to do.
What a shocker.
Yeah. So that was interesting with Vincent Lopez. Yeah, a really fascinating career, and totally forgotten. I kind of dove into it and started piecing it together. And I actually have I think of all the people I collect archival documents for a lot of the people I research, and I think I have the largest amount for him as far as books and photographs and rare items and whatnot.
So in his day, he was a big, big deal.
He was huge. Yeah.
And I have to confess, utter ignorance about him.
Yeah. I don't think anybody knows who he is.
Wow,
maybe somebody's grandparents, but
so unless you were alive at that time,
yeah,
and experiencing his celebrity, there's hardly a trace of it.
He disappeared pretty much off the cultural memory. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
But really incredible piano player. I really like listening to the recordings. I don't really focus or research much on people whose music I don't respect or enjoy.
Okay.
So I really like his music.
And one of his contemporaries was Paul Whiteman.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen the music videos that Paul Whiteman did in the early 30s?
No.
These things are as psychedelic and surreal as anything ever put on celluloid. I'll make sure I send you a link.
Yeah,
they are absolutely wild. And he was famous, and so there would have been production money available for that kind of thing. Yeah, so just as a side.
Oh yeah, well, that reminds me of one way Vincent Lopez used numerology was that, he had like an army of musicians and entertainers that were part of his entourage, and for like a core group of them, he would change their names using numerology, and fairly dubiously, he would use that numerological name change to contractually bind them as the years went by. And yeah, I mean, there's a kind of an interesting meaning for like the numbers that he chose to give different musicians. But a lot of, at least at that time, known musicians were going by the names that Vincent Lopez had numerologically given them, not their birth names.
Now, I do know that at least a few musicians with Latin names changed them to be more mainstream.
Right.
I don't know if that was part, but he didn't change his name, I guess.
No, he didn't.
Well, speaking of numerology and astrology and having an esoteric dimension, one of your programs is about a musician that was involved in the Sun Ra experience. Now, most of us experience Sun Ra as an amazing musician who had an amazing stagecraft.
Yeah.
But clearly there was more going on there.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what was going on? Because I don't know.
I mean, Sun Ra's a can of worms. He was synthesizing a lot of the kind of occult traditions that were available at the time, and lots of theosophy, lots of ancient Egyptian Hermeticism, and he was kind of stitching it together in his own way. And he would use numerology and astrology to kind of operate in his own poetic language. And there's a really incredible interview with Sun Ra, not an interview, I think it's just him talking into a microphone, where I think the title might be "I'm Such a Joke," and it's really about him kind of playing a joke on the audience and being not in terms of taking advantage of them, but in terms of putting them in a state of wonder, confusion, so that they are forced to reckon with something that they can't habitually, or they can't rely on their habits. I don't know. I love that little recording of him. He starts laughing. He's like, I'm so funny. I tickle myself, I think is how it ends.
This reminds me of something from the Mother Sales world, and I can't remember whether it was your documentary or the other documentary, and I think it was the other. Maybe it was you. You have to tell me that that in her compound, which was large, it was an entire city block with a 10-foot high wall around it. There were chickens and goats and burros and so on, and mules, and they were all coming and going through the ceremonies, and it was sort of controlled chaos.
Yeah.
Did you talk about that particularly in your documentary?
Yeah, I remember doing the animal noises too for that.
Okay. Well, and so there's another case of somebody deliberately shaking things up to get people out of their normal states of mind. Going back
to the music in those, ceremonies, the Black Hawk chants and some jazz traditional standards were used and gospel tunes, but part of especially with the Black Hawk chant, it was very trance oriented, so very repetitive, and you repeat it over and over and over again until the spirit catches, and then that's when someone like Ornette Coleman might feel the freedom of ecstatic expression, the Holy Spirit, but there was a unique ceremony that they were doing. It wasn't just jazz. They were tapping into something else.
Gotcha. And you probably know Ornette was really taken with the master musicians of Jajouka, and made that trip to the Rif Mountains in Morocco. And I actually sat around in his loft watching his home movies that he took. Oh, wow. Yeah. And he also went to Nigeria, which isn't as well known. Just as a sidebar on the Nigerian thing, he liked to go without a plan, so he just sort of showed up in this village and started playing. Yeah. And people just started gathering around him, and they started playing too. And finally the whole village just shut down. Everybody was just listening and playing and dancing. And one of the amazing things, I don't even know where this footage is. Donardo must have it, I hope. There were just some little boys, and I mean little, like 6 years old, they were kids, just jamming on these logs, just with just as good as any drummer you'd ever see on earth. But then of course he also went to Jajouka, and that's healing music, trance music. And of course Pythagoras, people think of him as the mathematician guy, and then some of them realize, well, he did the experiments with the strings, and if you have a string you get an octave, and so on and so forth. But according to my friend that is into the quote Greek, but it's really should be called the Eastern Mediterranean medical tradition, that music was also medicine as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Pythagoras was definitely a kind of a progenitor of like music therapy as we know it today. And that's a major function of the Black Hawk chant in the spiritual church in New Orleans, which also has a lot of resonances with the Afro-Cuban Lukumi tradition, which is really based on drums. Like the drums are coded to invoke certain deity spirits and called upon to heal and inspire congregants.
You did a great show on Mercedes Valdez.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah, I kind of know that tradition, and I've been to Cuba more than once and hung out in I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on the city east of Havana, the place that's the like kind of the real place. And I'm totally drawing blank. It's a small city. It's only 100,000 people, but it's one of the places where rumba started.
Okay.
It's the city that's when they always say, oh, Cuba's only 90 miles from the United States. Well, it's that city in particular that's only 90 miles, and it was the center of the sugar trade. So a lot of kidnapped and terrorized people were brought in from Africa through that particular port. And I got to look up the name of the city. I'm so it's funny. I should know Cuba map, but that is also.
I have a horrible sense of geography.
But I'm pretty good at geography, but for some reason I'm having one of those moments. It's a multi-syllable name. Matanzas, of course, Matanzas. Matanzas is kind of the place. It's when you want the real shit. That's where you go. And they have a very strong. Now you call it how do you call it? Lukumi. Yeah. And then a lot of people know of it as Santeria.
Right.
And of course, thanks to the what do you call it? When you take something and you blow it up and make it ridiculous, the way it's been not satirized, but exaggerated. Yeah, let's use that word. It's sort of comic book, and you'll see it on TV, and it's usually connected with some bad guy and so on and so forth. But the reality, which I got to see in Matanzas up close and personal, is totally different.
Yeah,
totally different. And you're talking earlier about Lopez, and his dad was very strict Catholic, but also into esoteric things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that tradition in Cuba borrows.
That's where it did combine.
Yeah.
Well, that's why the term Santeria kind of refers to the Catholic imposition. And so I think Lukumi is a more of a way to kind of have more indigenous pride in that tradition versus the Catholic influence.
Yeah, I mean, it means the way of the saint, Santeria. And I saw how it functioned, and it always was out of a person's home, just as the spiritualist churches in New Orleans were. Mm-hmm. And one thing I learned from the other documentary is a lot of them were in the lower nine, and of course the lower nine just got completely scraped by when that industrial canal wall collapsed.
Yeah.
So it's gone. Those, at least for now, those are gone. But the ceremonies, the real ones, the authentic things, are held in people's homes. They make the most beautiful altars you've ever seen.
Oh yeah.
They'll take a corner of the room and they'll pile it up with fruit and flowers and pictures and a lot of cake.
Yeah.
And then after the ceremony, they go up and down the street and give out cake to the neighbors. It's so interesting. And each event was functional. Like, for instance, one guy had gotten jumped and mugged. Yes, it does happen in Cuba too, and got beaten up pretty badly and was traumatized. And so he went to the leader, and the leader prescribed a party. They call it a party, a fiesta, for the saint. And the bata drummers come early. Yeah. Nobody's there yet, and they just start going. And then people sort of show up there's no clock. And then people start dancing, and then they start going out.
Yeah.
They start going into trance. And it's, some people might have seen the movie by Maya Deren. About right? I remember seeing that years ago and thinking, oh, that's so exotic,
The Dark Horseman, is that what it's
yeah,
called?
something like Dark Horse or Riding a Horse or something. It was because there's a similar tradition in Haiti. In fact, the tradition probably came from Haiti, but that's another story. And so that was my only experience with this, watching it in black and white, and then she shot it in slow motion, and it was very aesthetic. But that's what really happens. I was there in 2018 last time, and that's what it's like. And everybody's involved. It's not like an old person's thing. All the young people are involved in it. It's totally integral to the community. It's not like this is some ancient archaic
taboo
thing.
or weird.
Not at all. Totally woven into normal life, know. And they have a beautiful tradition, for example, of children's birthday parties. So for a child, they get a banana leaf, and then on the leaf is I think it's cake. Yeah, cake, and they sit around and they get to eat. And then the Orisha, or the saint, the Orisha for children is the guy at the crossroads. The main guy, the guy, he wears black and red. I'm drawing my mind. It's been a long day, and it's late in the day for me. But let me look who that is. But anyway, he's the trickster. Yeah. He's the guy that likes to fool around. Anyway, so when they have a child's birthday party, he's the saint that is represented, and they don't have the drums, and people don't go into trance for the kids' party. Yeah. But what happens is one of the adults sits in a chair, and at a certain point, the children are allowed to take whatever's left of their cake and smear it all over the adult. And they, of course, they love that. They think it's the greatest thing on earth. So that's another example of a practical thing. But, if somebody's got a problem, and let's face it, one thing that we do know about real medicine, as opposed to the fake industrial medicine that's taken over, is that many illnesses do have a social, psychological, emotional component. Yeah. And you can plug somebody with every drug in the world, and if they can't get over whatever that emotional thing is, they're never going to heal. Conversely, if you can pinpoint what that emotional thing is and release it, all the problems, the biochemical problems and everything go away. Yeah. So it seems to me, from my experience of hanging out with these people for a while, that's how they practice medicine. They had a plant tradition too, but it was really counseling, and then, okay, we're going to bring the whole community together in honor of your saint. We're going to throw a party for him, and that's how we're going to address this problem you have. Yeah. And these were fun parties. And people would come and go, and
good spirits. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, it makes sense. It makes sense. So tell me about Merceditas.
She's another amazing person. She started singing young, and then kind of came upon, it was two anthropologists who were studying, two Cuban anthropologists who were studying native traditions, and they really kind of wooed her into embracing more indigenous, the Lukumi Santeria tradition. And in that tradition, there is actually like a role for the musician as a leader of the practice, which is called the akpuan, and it's kind of like a religious singer, and that's what she became early on. Okay. She became one of the most famous ones. I believe she was the first one to record on vinyl. And
really?
Yeah. And kind of her role was really kind of fighting against the oppression of the, now I'm blanking.
Well, I can tell you about oppression. There's a music called son, mm-hmm. right, which is what people in the United States call salsa. And originally in the 1920s, that was considered just just trash, ghetto, garbage music that no decent person would ever listen to.
Yeah.
Because it involved drums.
Right.
It involved indigenous or adaptations of indigenous drums. So that's one example of that music being having a bad light shed on it. But also for a brief period before they found their way, the communists were not very excited about some of this music, and it was banned.
Right.
In fact, one of the places I went, this was so cool. They had made wooden couches and chairs that were actually drums, but they didn't look like drums. But you'd play them on the side, right, or on the arms.
No.
Okay. And so when the cops came and said, "We heard music somewhere in this neighborhood," and they go, "Yeah, we heard it too. I don't know where those guys are. I hope you find them." And they'd be right there standing in front of the drums, but the drums were shaped like chairs, nice, like easy, like sort of easy chairs, but made out of wood. So there was that repression as well.
Well, and a lot of that, there was the Cuban nationalism, which was kind of trying to extricate any African influence. And in the Lukumi Santeria tradition, there's a strong African strain that's part of that identity, but that many natives really felt was central to their way of life. And so these anthropologists and Merceditas Valdez kind of putting forward that music, putting on the stage and traveling and touring it around and making people aware of it, recording it, that was really their effort to kind of preserve and celebrate that cultural heritage that the Cuban government was trying to suppress. And they did suppress it for quite a while.
And this was the 30s and 40s?
Yeah.
Yeah. There was an attempt to Europeanize Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
So they changed their immigration policy and they let a lot of Spanish people in, and I think they were hoping, there's a myth that Cuba is this naturally egalitarian place, and I think they're striving for that. But that is not the reality. It's got a lot of the same problems that other parts of North America have,
sure.
Where people are judged on the tone of their skin.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, the Orisha that I was thinking of, that's the Orisha of many things, the crossroads, is also the child's birthday party is Elegua.
Elegua, yeah.
Elegua. So that's a pretty big deal that she accomplished, because now these things are accepted, they're integrated into Cuban society. Mm-hmm. They're a part of Cuban culture, as Cuban culture represents itself to the world. When you're in Cuba, you can go to a lot of events that cultural events that highlight I call it Santeria, but the other term too. Yeah. It's not something put in the shadows anymore. It's not something to downgrade or marginalize. It's right up at the fore.
And it's a beautiful music. It's really powerful, beautiful music.
Yeah, and as you probably know, each saint, each Orisha, and the Orishas are, it's like people go, "Oh, this is so foreign," it's like, well, what do you think the ancient Greeks and Romans were talking about all the time, right? They had the god of love and the god of war, and these were sort of like imaginative embodiments of certain energies, right? So that's what the Orisha are, and the Africans have Orisha, and then in Cuba they're the saints.
Well, and there's an incredible band in New York that I recommend everyone check out called Okonkolo, and that is a Santeria Lukumi tradition and ensemble. And what's the man? Rodriguez is his name.
Okonkolo.
Yeah, that music. I mean, the music is beautiful as it traditionally is, but the musicians he works with and the production of the recordings, the arrangements, like it's really, that to me is like the peak of that music.
Oh, neat. Okay,
that's contemporary.
We're so lucky, people that live within a drive or a day of New York, because if you can't make it to Cuba, but you can make it to New York, you can get a whole lot of great Cuban.
Oh yeah, definitely. There's a strong community there. Yeah, I think it was an album called Rezos. It came out a few years back, and I'm just still kind of bowled over that it hasn't gotten more attention, because it's really one of the more stunning albums I've heard in the last decade.
Gotcha. The guy that worked with with Valdez, the singer, that wasn't Fernando Ortiz, was it?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, I unfortunately, there's perennial problems with traveling to Cuba. Many of them put in place by our government. Now, unfortunately, with the I don't know what to call it, the pandemic thing, the lockdown thing, Cuba took all that stuff very much to heart, and the lockdowns were very severe. I mean, they had curfews where you could not be out on the street after a certain hour, and that economy, especially the musicians, really depend on visitors, and so the fact that visitors haven't been allowed to come until fairly recently. The good news is the Havana Jazz Festival, which is one of the great music events of the planet, really unbelievable. That is back. That they just started up again this year.
Oh, that's great.
By the way, there's another amazing event that's talk about off the radar. The Havana Jazz Festival is kind of off the radar, and which is unfortunate, because the Jazz Festival obviously attracts all the Cuban jazz musicians, but it also attracts and it attracts some musicians from around the world. Not a lot, because they don't pay, but people are just happy to come down and play anyhow. But all the musicians of Cuba join in that festival. So even if somebody's not a jazz musician, and you'll see combinations of musicians playing together in the Havana Jazz Festival that you would normally never see on the same stage.
Right.
But they share a fundamental aesthetic, so it all works. But the other great festival, and this is a real sleeper, and I totally recommend it to people, is the Festival de Tambor, the drum festival, which takes place, I think, in March. That thing's off the hook. That thing's just crazy good, and it's not just drums too. It's just that drumming is the core and the center of it, but it draws lots of people. And Matanzas now has a little jazz festival, and we're hoping for good things in Matanzas. Matanzas is really a cool little place. It was very wealthy. The ballroom music that was kind of one of the first Creole fusion musics of the entire Western Hemisphere, which again, another thing I can't remember the name of, danzón, originated in Matanzas. And that has such a huge impact. If you ever travel, like in Mexico, the danzón tradition is alive and well, and danzón bands and outdoor public community dancing, and which you don't even see in Cuba anymore, but they still retain some of that in Mexico.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, it's a wild world out there, and and a lot of it's good. So there's so many programs that you've done, and the theme running through it is where music and musical creation and expression intersect with a spiritual or esoteric stream.
Yeah, essentially. I mean, I'm really interested in broader aspects of like intuition, inspiration, imagination. And I've just found through my personal experience and through historical research that these esoteric traditions, which go by many names, the mysticism, hermeticism, the occult, paranormal, it's a really big bag of tricks that's very misunderstood generally, and abused a lot of times. Sure. But when taken undogmatically and with an open mind and a good heart, they are some of the most advanced traditions of intuitive discipline that humanity has ever created. That's my take on it. And so I've, after writing a book on Arthur Russell called Buddhist Bubblegum, Arthur is a cellist in New York who did all kinds of genres, and applied Vajrayana or esoteric Buddhism to his music and his creative process through meditation, mandala, numerology, all these things that I've been talking about. And after putting that together, I was like, oh, well, this is the lineage that I feel more drawn to than, it is a spiritual thing for me, but it's really focused on that kind of tapping in through an intuitive approach to music that's not based on style. That was kind of a guiding thing, even though I have a jazz rock background growing up. So I went back looking through history. I was like, well, I want to find more people like this. Who were the other people that were inspired by these kinds of traditions? And the more I looked, the more I found. And I just, I would go digging through 19th century newspapers and obscure periodicals, and I continued to discover kind of hidden jewels and really wonderful, inspiring people. But these traditions, really cover a lot of different branches, and the three main ones in America of kind of metaphysical or esoteric traditions are spiritualism, New Thought philosophy, or mind metaphysics, and Theosophy, or the Theosophical Society. And a lot of those, they deal with spirit invocation of some kind or another, ceremony, visualization, meditative practices, symbolic systems, alchemy, all of these things. And so, yeah, I've just kind of been rummaging through history, collecting these artists who have found agency through these traditions. And along the way, I've realized that it has been one of the more inclusive representations of American music history. Turns out that people who are oppressed in American society are drawn to these traditions because they focus on self-empowerment beyond material and cultural identifications of race or gender or so forth. So they are empowering to those who are oppressed in society. So it's not really a surprise that there's lots of people of color, lots of women, lots of gay and lesbian artists who appear in this history just naturally. So I've been delighted by that.
Gotcha. Yeah, going back to Mother Sales, in addition to the musical component, and she was a trombone player.
Yeah.
And God, wouldn't we love to be hearing what
I wish I had a recording.
Oh my God. And she brought a lot of music into what she did. But there was also a practical consideration of helping people who were not getting help.
She was specifically, she put a lot of her focus on pregnant women, especially pregnant women in trouble and are struggling to take care of themselves. She left an abusive husband and kind of found healing with Mother Leafy Anderson, the original founder of that church in New Orleans. And she took over from Mother Leafy Anderson when she passed away, but it was leaving that abusive relationship. So there was a strong focus on female empowerment in particular, which is a really special thing in that.
Well, even today, think about it. Where does a young pregnant woman who needs help go?
Right.
If she doesn't have a social support system, where do you go today in 2023? Mm-hmm. But her doors were open to everyone, right? It wasn't anybody, and she was inspired. Part of her inspiration, if I understand her history correctly, is she went to a spiritual healer. Mm-hmm. And originally in the spiritual healer, because she had a real problem based on actually being brutalized by one of her husbands. And he said, well, I can't treat you, you're Black.
Right.
It's like, oh my God. So there's this practical concern. It's not just sort of theoretical or head in the clouds kind of stuff. Well, first of all, music's very practical. When you sit down to play, you better have some idea of what you're doing, or it's not going to go very well. You don't have to know exactly where you're going, but you have to be able to walk on 2 feet musically. So music, even though musicians are sometimes portrayed as being ethereal, and they are to a degree, there's also an intense practicality. They've got to keep their instruments in shape, for one thing, right? Your guitar needs new strings. If you've got a horn, you're constantly having to get it repaired. If you have a piano, it better be tuned, So there's all these very practical, down-to-earth things. And I noticed that a lot of the people that you featured were also people that were, just helping other people as well.
Yeah.
Either as healers or just providing an example. About your audio documentaries, how did you get, because your work is beautiful. Like, how did you learn that? How did you find yourself making them? What happened?
I guess it started off as kind of like an audio journal. Like I was like, well, I'm talking about sound and music. I want to share what I'm finding with people, but I wasn't quite ready to write yet. So I just started I made the first one, and it felt really good especially the first one is on Francis Grierson, who was a psychic piano player at the turn of the century. Really fascinating figure. And there's no recordings of him, just like there's not of Mother Seals. And so I was like, well, I didn't want to feel like I couldn't share it without having music. But I was like, if I can paint the story somewhat, then that would satisfy my desire to share and present it in a way that gives it some heft to the story. So I really kind of got into it that way. And I love researching. I love editing audio.
Okay.
Doing soundscapes and scores and stuff like that. So everything about it is enjoyable for me. It just takes a lot of time, which I don't always have.
Gotcha. Yeah, because they're beautifully crafted. And sometimes when you hear, like, if something's on NPR, they'll go, and thanks to assistant producer John Smith and second assistant producer Bill Jones and audio engineer, and it's right. They list like 100 guys.
Well, yeah, I've had some people I respect kind of reach out to me and be like, you realize what you're doing normally takes like a crew of 12 people.
It's true. It's true. And so I'm going to ask the question, it's just you, right?
It's just me. Yeah.
Amazing.
But the pandemic really served me well in that regard, because that's when I really threw myself into it, kind of devotionally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, for people that want to hear about what we've been talking about, and I urge you to, if you're a jazz cat, start with the jazz guys, but you're going to want to listen to every single show Matt's created because they're fascinating. It's Matt Marble, Matt with 2 T's, Marble spelled the way you would spell marble.net. And you can just listen to the podcasts and
Secret Sound.
Yeah, Secret Sound.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're absolutely wonderful. It's tickled me and delighted me to no end to stumble on them. I hope this is okay. I burned them all to MP3. They're on a CD, and I listen to them in my car. I don't know if is that authorized use?
Oh, it's free. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's what I'm listening to now when I drive around.
Awesome.
And it makes driving a lot more pleasant.
Yeah, I think there's 45 episodes now, so a lot.
It's amazing. So it's mattmarble.net. I just urge everybody to check one out, and it's like a potato chip. You can't eat just one. You'll end up wanting to listen to the whole series. So, Matt, is there anything that we didn't say that you'd like to say as a parting message or statement to our audience?
Well, the website offers a pretty good kind of introduction, and that it also has, you can look up things by tradition, you can look up things by like things related to dreams or things related to astrology. I've tried to keep track of it that way. My book Buddhist Bubblegum is available via Cool Grove Press. If you don't know Arthur Russell, I encourage you to explore his world as well. I did just publish an article on Vincent Lopez in the New Philosophical Research Society journal. And I'm kind of slowly working on a book, a cultural history book of the Secret Sound material, but that's still in the works. I've subsequently started another audio series, an interview series called The Hidden Present, which is also on my website, which is also free.
Oh, okay.
And that's where I've interviewed a cellular biologist, chef, painters, just people from different walks of life on intuition and spiritual imagination and that kind of thing. So I encourage you to check that out. There's 5 episodes right now, with 2 more coming.
Great. What's that one? What's that series called again?
That's called The Hidden Present. And
the hidden present. I'll off camera here. I have 2 people to recommend you to check out that you might enjoy. Well, Matt, thanks again. I'm so glad I found your work. I have to thank Mother Sales for that. And
I have a picture of her on an altar, my dad's old preaching altar right now.
Okay, cool.
With some Mardi Gras beads.
Yeah, and I found her through Ornette, and yeah. So I'm really glad that you are around. I mean, I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. And again, it's mattmarble.net. Check it out is all I can say. So thanks a lot, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. Happy Mardi Gras, y'all.
You too.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please share it. That's how we grow. And remember to subscribe to JazzOnTheTube.com, the internet's largest collection of free, streamable, classic jazz videos.